9. I realized that Ed already covered Joshua chapter 9. It has to do with the Gibeonite deception. But there are some things that I want to do specifically with this chapter, and especially because, here, let me pull this next slide up so you can see the heading for this one. Especially since on Sunday morning, going through the Sermon on the Mount, the lesson for Sunday morning is the one about oaths. Don't make an oath. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And so this study with the Gibeonites, or I suppose with the leaders, Joshua and the leaders of God's people, really lines up well with what I've been studying with that. Just a general conversation about character and integrity among God's people. And so I wanted to do this really just for me. I think it's important, and I'm glad. Carson and Adam, you guys are back there. You ladies too, and you guys here. I'm glad that you guys are upstairs for this class, because it's true for all people, but this is something that I think is going to be important for us. It is important for us. Always has been. Are there any announcements or anything to say before we get started with a prayer? All right, well, let's go ahead and bow, and then we'll get into the text. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the good day that you've blessed us with. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to be together, to open up the Bible and to read a story that happened in the past between your people and how they related to others who were not your people. Help us, Father, as we read this story, to appreciate that it's not just a collection of historical facts, but that you are revealing yourself to us in these truths and teaching us what kind of people you want us to be and what kind of hearts you want us to have. Thank you so much for giving us this direction. Please help us to have eyes to see and ears to hear, and help us to have willing hearts to be able to make the changes that we need to in our lives in order to be pleasing to you. It's in your Son's name that we pray all things. Amen. Okay. So let's just go ahead and start. Can I please get someone to read, starting in Joshua chapter 9, would you read verses 1 through 14, please? Nice and loud for us.
Where do you want to start? I'm sorry.
Somebody, the people who are online right now are like, I can't hear. Nobody's reading, so that's, yeah, Ryan, it's Joshua 9, verses 1 through 14.
As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and in the lowland all along the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes, and all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, Perhaps you live among us. Then how can we make a covenant with you? They said to Joshua, We are your servants. And Joshua said to them, Who are you, and where do you come from? They said to him, From a very distant country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses, as our food for the journey on the day that we set out to come to you. But now behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for reading that, Ryan. Let me point you to the first thing that I want to make sure. I know by this point in our study of Joshua that everybody already knows this, but I want to make sure that we all have we hear these words and it makes us squirm and uncomfortable when we read what's going on here. And I'll tell you what I've done in my Bible, and as always, I don't expect anybody to do this, but I think that it's helpful. And so if you would like to mark these things, in verse 6, they're asked, at the very end of verse 6, these Gibeonites, they say, we've come from a distant country, and these are the words that they say, make a covenant with us. And the reason why I want to spend some time, especially looking at these next three passages, I marked 3 passages in my margin next to this, because God used these words and specifically said to Israel, do not make a covenant with the people when you go into the land. There's no gray area here in what's going on. This is wrong. And should not have happened. The first of the 3 passages is Exodus 23, starting in verse 31. Exodus 23, and we'll do verses 31 through 33. I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me, for if you serve their gods, I will surely be a snare to you. I want us to make sure that we see, especially the words, God said from the very start, do not make a covenant with the people. And here are the people using the words in verse 6, Joshua 9 and verse 6, make a covenant with us. We ought to say, red flag, red flag, red flag, this is bad. The second one is Exodus 34 in verses 11 through 16. I don't think that we'll read the whole section of this. Exodus 34, in verses 11 through 16, this is what God says to the people. Just one little section here. Take care, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. The other one is Deuteronomy 7 in verses 1 and 2. Deuteronomy 7 is the biggie that I always think of. This is the one where God said, when you go into the land, you need to get rid of all of the people. Don't make a covenant with them. Don't marry their daughters and all of this. Deuteronomy 7 in verses 1 and 2, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. So let's just start with this all on the same page. Here are the people of the land. And we know, we can identify them as the Hivites. They're specifically called the Hivites. They come and they say, make a covenant with us. Is there any way that this could have been okay? If you're Israel, after what God has said, I mean, we read 3 passages that make it abundantly clear. Do not make a covenant with the people in the land. And so here it is. You should not have made this covenant. That's point number one. Do you have any comments that you'd like to say or questions about this? If you're online, I would encourage you to, I know that people use Facebook and stuff, and I don't know if anybody's doing that, but Dave is in the back right now, and Ryan Awad is in the back right now. I would say just go ahead and text your comments to Dave, and it'll be faster, and he can relay those to me if you'd like to participate in that way. But on the same page, right? We have to be on the same page with this. Don't make a covenant with the people. Number 2. But they did. We know that it's wrong, but they made the covenant. That's going to be chapter 9 and verse 15. There's a couple places where you'll see a reference to this, but Joshua chapter 9 and verse 15 is like the one sentence summary that describes what happened. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So there it is. Yep, Sarah?
I don't know if I have a complete thought on this, but the last time I read this, I was just thinking of Rahab and why was she different? Because in essence, they made a covenant with her and saved her, even though she was lumped in with everything that's supposed to be destroyed, and they, I don't know. I was just thinking, Rahab heard what God did with Egypt and the kings, and then she had faith in God and wanted to appeal to Him for mercy and compassion. And then you see a bunch of other kings, a big group of people who wanted to fight against them. And then you see this other smaller group that wants to act deceptively. And I don't really know what that is. I feel like I can see like the different responses, and then the deception is still something hard for me to figure out in my mind, because down later in the chapter, in verse 26, it says, well, my version says Joshua rescued them from the Israelites, and they served the altar, which seems like a close role to God for someone that came in through deception. It's just something that, I don't have answers to.
Yeah, no. I think you're 100% right. In fact, let me tell you this, what I did. I threw this slide on here because I thought, if we get finished with this subject tonight, then I want to do something else. But I don't think that I'm going to do what you're saying. The comparisons, and I don't know if it's subconsciously or if you intentionally caught it or not, the parallels between Rahab and the Gibeonites are just in every sentence, almost. And so what I think, let me just go ahead here real quick. I think what I'll do is I'll probably do this on Sunday night. This will be my Sunday night lesson. But look at this. You're 100% right. Look at all of these things that Rahab and the Gibeonites have in common. And what we'll do Sunday night is we'll do what you just said. So yes, 100%. God, well, I think one of the main lessons that comes from that is God won't turn anybody away who wants to come to Him for salvation. With a repentant heart in faith, He's not going to turn you away. And we'll look at other examples of that. But having said that, God did specifically say, don't make a covenant with the people of the land and don't let them live. And then the very next verse is, Joshua made a covenant with them and let them live. He says both things. I think that ought to make us uncomfortable. And I'll ask you, I want to ask you this as we go on later on, but I'll specifically give you a chance to say this, but let's say that you're standing in the crowd of Israelite leaders among Joshua, or maybe you're one of the Israelites who are listening to what the leaders have to say about this situation. What are you going to say when you know that God said, don't make a covenant, don't let them live? Joshua and the leaders made a covenant and let them live. Look at verses 16 and 17. At the end of 3 days, after they made the covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. I think that this is a positive statement. That the Israelites said, oh no, we've done something that we shouldn't have done. Let's go fix our mistake. I mean, if you make a mistake, you fix your mistake. And so I think that's what they're doing. Look at verse 18. I think that if we're going to paint a full picture of this situation, you got to put yourself in these circumstances and hear what's happening. Verse 18, but the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. What does that sound like to you? What does it immediately make you think of when you read that sentence? All the congregation of Israel murmured against the leaders. Yeah, all through Exodus and the book of Numbers. The word murmur here is used 14 times in the Old Testament. 13 are in Exodus and Numbers, and they're almost always, in the ESV, they're translated grumble. When the people grumbled against Moses and against God, ultimately. And so here is the congregation, the entire nation. Don't overlook the words. Verse 18. All the congregation murmured against the leaders. Let's talk about this at this point. Why? What is their murmuring? Make your complaint. Put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites who are in this situation. What are you saying right now about the leaders and about this covenant? What are you concerned about? Anybody remember Achan? I bet all these guys remember Achan. Achan broke God's rules. He took some of the stuff that he wasn't supposed to take. And what was the consequence of him breaking God's rules? The Israelites, a handful of Israelites died in battle. They lost. Achan and his family got stoned and burned, and God made this huge point. Do not disobey me. And so you are Israel, and you remember Achan. It just happened a couple chapters ago. If you're Israel, it just happened a little bit ago. And you remember what happened to Achan, and you say, guys, God said not to do this, and we did it. What does that mean for us as a nation? What's our next battle going to be like if we just broke God's rules? I'll give you a chance if you want to shout something out. I got all kinds of things that I can think of here. Would you be mad at your leaders for having been deceived in the first place if you're Israel? Yeah, Ryan?
I think of the language in verse 14, and they did not ask the counsel of the Lord, and it's very similar to Saul, whenever he would go into battle, and, is he supposed to wait for Samuel before the sacrifice, but no, he's going to make a sacrifice whenever he wants to, and he didn't ask the counsel of the Lord or go to the prophets, and I think that it's a similar failure in leadership.
Yeah. That is That is the one thing highlighted on this page because that's the main point of this story. That they did not ask the counsel of the Lord. And let's just put an exclamation mark on this in chapter 9 and verse 6. They went, the Gibeonites, they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, in verse 15, Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. You see it also in verse 18, the leaders of the congregation. Back in chapter 8 and verse 33, I think what we can do is we can say these are the elders of the people. That's how they're identified back in 8:33, the elders of the people. So Joshua, the elders, the leaders of the people, the men of Israel, those who are making the decisions at this point, they messed this up because they didn't ask God for counsel. This is on them. They made a mistake. I think that's the main point of the story. They made a mistake. And if you are all Israel and you remember Achan and the consequences for what happened with Achan, and your leaders just made this mistake, how do you feel about it? You think you're pretty upset? I'd be upset about it. Maybe I'm just like the faithless Israelites and you all are better than me in this way, but I think I'd be upset about it. Another one? Maybe the murmuring, can you imagine this one? Maybe the murmuring had to do with this covenant. Was this covenant with a contract, agreement? Was it made in good faith? Why do you say no, Scott?
They lied about where they came from, which maybe the Israelites wouldn't have made the covenant if they had known.
Yeah.
Which I was thinking ignorance of the law doesn't mean you don't obey the law.
Yeah. So we're going to make a contract, you and I. And you're going to lie to me about your end of the circumstances. How does that make me feel about the contract? After this contract has not been made in good faith. I mean, do you think it's fair? Do you think it's fair if you're trying to say, well, what did the murmuring of Israel sound like? Do you think it's fair to think that maybe you would have said something like, the contract is void? It's not a valid contract at this point. I'm not asking you if you think these statements are right, but can you at least see somebody from this perspective saying, we don't have to do that contract. That contract shouldn't have been made in the first place. It was made in bad faith. They lied. Yeah, Sarah?
I was thinking, if they had come and they're not a part of that Canaanite land, like there's some outskirt area, then why would the Israelites care? Like, that's not their, God gave them a realm of Canaan, conquer Canaan. And then here are these people who come from somewhere else come in, and I was just thinking maybe they're kind of stepping in on God's toes because they're, we'll make a treaty with this nation that isn't even, we're making it. So in that way, they're kind of like, I think of that time when Moses struck the rock and said, do I have to save you guys again, or whatever, kind of taking the place of God and not honoring him and not fully looking to him for direction.
Yeah.
And he was rebuked by God, and I wonder if this is a similar
Yeah.
thing where they really thought about it. It seems like to us, I don't know, maybe if they, in their hearts, they have some selfish motive of gain in some way.
I think it was also about, because you brought up Moses too, we inadvertently getting a little arrogant because you had a few victories, you start forgetting those victories come from God, and you start thinking it's really coming from you. And maybe unintentionally, their minds were there without realizing it.
Yeah.
Because Joshua never seemed to be somebody who would intentionally disobey God.
Right. Yeah. But he didn't ask.
He can mess up.
Yeah.
So he maybe got a little slack in his judgment and just, to a point not paying attention and remembering that it comes from God, not him. Just like Moses did.
I've pulled this quote in regard to what you're talking about, and Ryan, to your comment too about not asking for counsel. I love this comment. Incidentally, I got this out of a commentary, and this commentary put this quote that I'm about to read you. This doesn't have anything to do with the class. I just think it's interesting. They said, this quote came from George W. Bush's comments on the book of Joshua. And I really wanted to know more about that, and I can't find George W. Bush's comments on the book of Joshua to save my life on the internet. So if you can find that, I want to know. But supposedly that's where this comes from. That's where the citation is anyway. It says, no proposed course of conduct can be so clear to a Christian as to excuse him from the duty of seeking direction from above. There can be no course so clear to excuse me from asking God about which way to go. Sarah, let's do this while we're here. Look at Deuteronomy 20. I think this is a great time to look at Deuteronomy chapter 20 because God said to Israel, when you go into the promised land, everybody dies. It's the ban. There's no covenants with the people of the land. But there are going to be people that they make covenants and contracts with. And Deuteronomy 20 is where that comes from. In verse 1, when you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart be faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and to give victory. There's your point, Scott, and what they're supposed to say. Verse 5. Then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, Is there any man... let's see. I don't think we need to read this whole section. Verse 10. When you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall put all of its males to the sword, but the women and the little ones, the livestock, they're going to be forced labor. That's exactly, Israel did exactly what God told them to do to foreigners. That's why I think they say, the Gibeonites say at least 3 times, we've come from a distant land. Somewhere they heard, those are the magic words to not get killed. So, the big picture, Israel should not have made a covenant. They did make a covenant. All the congregation murmured against Israel's leaders. If I'm Joshua, I got 4 things here, and I'll go on to the next one. Number 1, I'm mad that I got tricked. I'm worried about the consequences of my bad decision. Everyone is pressuring me to break my word. Like everyone is pressuring me to break my word. What are you going to do if you're Joshua? Look at chapter 9 and verses 18 through 21. Joshua 9, starting in verse 18. But the people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. But all the leaders said to all the congregation, We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This is what we'll do to them. Let them live, lest there be wrath upon us because of the oath that we swore to them. And the leaders said to them, Let them live. So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said of them. And then also Joshua says in verse 26, Joshua, he did this to them and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. just a thought here. Is this what you would have done? If you're Joshua, or if you're one of the leaders of the people, and I know this is text. When you read a story, you're reading the words on the page. You just go from one thought to the next thought, and you don't get to actually be standing in the moment at that time and feel the pain in a person's gut as they wrestle with what is the right thing to do in this situation. But at least as you're reading through the story, it doesn't seem like they hesitate. It's a covenant made in bad faith. There was lying involved. God told us not to do it. All the people are pressuring me. And they say, let's go. Come on, let's go. We got to get these people. And the leaders say, we gave them our word. We can't do this. This is a tight spot. To me, it's a tight spot. And where you say, what is the right thing to do here? But the text specifically points us to the right thing is to do what you said. And to be a person of your word and to honor that word. It's a covenant. And I love these verses that they speak here, verses 18 through 21, where the leaders say, the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord. All the leaders said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. We may not touch them. We can't do the thing that you want to do right now that God told us to do because we gave them our word that we wouldn't. This is starting to point me towards this real life practical lesson about integrity and character for all of us. And being people who do what we say. Especially, not even when, but especially when it's hard. I said, I'm going to let you live. And I've got to do what I said I was going to do.
I think it's also an example of Joshua. I think you and I have talked about this. He was the perfect soldier, always totally obedient, never blinked. When God said it, he did it. That even a man like him can mess up. And so it's not just about integrity, it's also something to learn from him that nobody's above, being perfect like Christ.
Yeah.
Even Joshua, who got pretty close, he still messed up.
Yeah.
And that's another reason that, to me, supports that he didn't realize he got arrogant until it happened. And I think as soon as it did happen, he was like, oh, I know exactly what I did.
Yeah.
And then part of that honoring the covenant was his way of repenting too.
Yeah. I'll take the consequences, but I gave my word. Dave?
What I'm seeing in this, along with what you guys are pointing out, is this healthy fear from both the leaders of Israel as well as the Gibeonites and those who were with them. One is the fear of being destroyed by God's people and God, being the Gibeonites, and then Joshua and the leaders have that same fear because it says in the Joshua 9 passage that they were afraid of the curse that would come for breaking their oath that they vowed to God. And that's where I go off on a tangent on marriage vows. But that's the intensity.
It's not a tangent. It's the point of this class and doing what we say.
But the reality of what they're facing is they've honored an oath, or they're honoring an oath to a power unseen, while the people are murmuring and pressing to not honor that oath. So there's this inner understanding of all this power that's giving us all this victory and deliverance. All that wrath could be reversed on us if we go back on our covenant that we've made.
Mm-hmm.
realize that they're doing stuff wrong, but in this case, they knew they were stuck with it when the leaders said that.
Yeah.
And they murmured against leaders because, well, you put us in this position because you didn't do what was right.
Yeah. That's a tight spot. This is a real, yeah.
They accepted it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's what I want to do. They accepted it. So here's what, I wrote this on the point. I didn't know how else to write this. Maybe you have a better way to say this, but this is how I did this one. The last point there. Joshua and the leaders honored their word. We can't go and kill them because we gave them our word that we wouldn't. But then the next point, I wrote it like this. No, seriously. They really honored their word. And that's in chapter 10. Chapter 10, I'm not going to read the first 5 verses, but the moral of the story here is that the Gibeonites and all of their friends were planning to go and fight against Joshua together. And now the Gibeonites have defected and gone to Joshua's side of the army. And so in verse 4, here's what they say. Come up and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel. And the 5 kings of Jerusalem go with their armies, and they make war against it. In verse 6, the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us. So here's the question. If you're Joshua and the leaders of the people, and we're all humans, so you're pretty salty about everything that just went down. I got lied to. They made a bad faith contract. The people are mad at me. We went and we were going to attack them, but we gave them our word, so we can't attack them. That's what we said. We're not going to kill them. But now they're crying out for help. If you're Joshua and the leaders of the people, it seems to me like this is a really good time to say, I mean, you made your bed. This is the consequences of your decisions here. I don't know that I have to help you out of this situation. One thing that's really neat to me, I think, in the book of Joshua, in verse 6, it says, do not relax your hand from your servants. That's the same word that was used earlier in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 5. It's what God said to Joshua, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. The word leave, when God said to Joshua, I will not leave you, that's the same word that the Gibeonites say. Do not relax your hand. Don't leave us. In verse 7, so Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. The Lord said to Joshua, and they go and they fight. Listen, here's a quote. This is something that I didn't know about this. The march, I'm reading. The march, which covered a distance of about 20 miles, would have taken 8 to 10 hours. This is not like, hey, come over a couple of minutes later and help us out of this tight spot. They say, we're in big trouble, and the only way that Joshua has a chance of helping them out of this is to say, everybody pack up your stuff, we're marching 20 miles all night long, and we're going to fight in the morning. So you gave your word, and you held to your word. I'm not going to kill you. I said I wouldn't kill you. This is not going the extra mile, this is going the extra 20 miles. Would you do it? I don't know, maybe the answer is yes, but would you? If you told somebody, if they tricked you and you told somebody, here's what I'm going to do, would you do it still? I mean, the answer is we should, but would you really?
But that covenant was an alliance.
Yeah.
Part of that covenant is that they would
Yeah.
join them in battle.
Right. I'll help you.
If they didn't go save them, they would have broken the covenant there.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's just a part of the agreement. Dave?
Yeah, I think, proceeding it all with what I would say is kind of our modern view of conveniences in traveling and the annoyance of going to do all that. It's something that still resides in the fact of we've made a covenant before God to do this, and He could destroy us if we do not uphold our end. Yes, in their hearts they could have been killing them, literally half-heartedly, like they're not interested in or defending the Gibeonites. But at the same time, that's kind of what Israel's struggle was the whole way.
Yeah.
But I think, they're still having to carry out the oath,
Yeah.
and that's what builds the faith. That action, the faith action. I hate saying it that way, but faithfully obeying your leaders to do what they've vowed to God. You're upholding what your people have said to do.
Yeah. So let me just point you to this too. Ed referred to this last week when he was talking about this. In 2 Samuel 21 and verses 1 through 9, Saul, it's not recorded when he did this, but Saul went after the Gibeonites. And as best as I can tell, Saul goes after the Gibeonites to clean them out. It's about 350 years down the road from where we are. Saul goes after the Gibeonites 350 years later. You think that covenant's still in effect 350 years later? And besides, this was Joshua and the people. Now there's a king. This is King Saul. He can do whatever he wants to do. And Saul pays a steep price for breaking this covenant. He pays with the lives of his children. 7, I think, of his children. And this is just, I threw this one up here, Nehemiah 3 and Nehemiah 7, because what's the year that I wrote down on this one? This is 950 years later. When the Jewish people come back from Babylonian captivity in Nehemiah, the Gibeonites are listed as people who are helping to build the wall. And they came back with the Jewish people. And when Joshua said, here we go, you're going to work among the temple, they're going to work among the house of God. He was serious about that. And 1,000 years down the road, they were still doing it. It's really cool to see that. And so the question, this is going to be the question for us. Does integrity matter? And you say, yeah, we should be people who tell the truth. But no, hold on just a second. Does integrity matter? A lot. Not just we should be people who tell the truth, but we are people who do what we say we're going to do all the way to the end of the road. It looks like I'm about to run out of time here, so I'm going to throw these up here for you real quick. Some lessons. God's people are people who do what they say. I think that this is something that we should think about. When we, the people, think about our leaders, the word politician in our world is almost synonymous with liar. Most of us probably assume all politicians are liars. In fact, we say, this is a part, you don't get to that level of government without having not been a person of character and integrity. And so here's the kinds of stuff that we hear. We shouldn't have been in that covenant in the first place. Our leaders before made a bad choice. That covenant was made in bad faith. Does that matter? Didn't seem to matter to God. And then I put on this last one, what do we do when we get ourselves into a mess? I just saw a couple of quotes that I thought were worth reading. Live as faithfully as you can within a twisted situation. I like that. Do the best you can with what you have. And we must glorify and magnify the grace of God even in our messes. I think that the leaders in Joshua did a pretty good job of that. I'll stop here, but may God help us all to be people of integrity who do what we say we're going to do. thanks for your participation in class tonight, and I won't have another chance to talk to you, so happy Thanksgiving. We're going to get settled, and Ryan's going to lead us in singing, and Mike's going to do an invitation in a minute.